It's been repeated so many times that it has to be true that every minister writes their sermon for a congregation of one, themselves. Well, this is really true of my words this morning. In fact, for me at least, my sermon is definitely a bit of self-service. This is a sermon about me, for me, and you just happen to be here to listen in. Why this is the case will become clear, I believe, in a moment. So be patient, be loving, be supportive, be kind. I'm going to the General Assembly, which is going to be in Baltimore this year. For those of you who don't know, a General Assembly is it's an annual event. It's when all the Unitarian Universalists in the nation and sometimes around the world, they all get together. And there can be anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 of us gathering, schmoozing, singing, doing all the things that we do, going out demonstrating, protesting. And this year we'll be in Baltimore. And it will be the first General Assembly I've attended since I retired. Before that, I probably attended 40 straight General Assemblies. And when I look at the program, not a lot has changed. It basically is pretty much the same, which includes the 2 days before all of you would arrive. And I understand there's about 25 of you who are going to be going at some point to the Baltimore GA. But about 2 days before everybody else arrives, the ministers meet. And there's approximately 400 to 600 ministers who get together and do all the things that you would do, which is schmooze. We try to go to a ball game, but the Orioles aren't in town. And there are several highlights, at least for me, there are several highlights of every minister's meeting. And there are workshops, there's time to eat together, check in with everybody. And then there are worship services, a lot of worship services, a lot of preaching. And one of my favorite over the years has always been the worship service that recognizes the 25 ministers, the class of 25, those who have been ordained for 25 years, and those who have been ordained for 50 years. And while those who have been ordained for 25 years are always interesting, I've always been kind of too close to them to really appreciate what they have to say. But the 50-year ministers, they are a special group. You know, I look at anybody who's lasted for 50 years in the profession of ministry has got something really going for them. And they always have some really good nuggets. Now, the only thing is this service has changed. I think that the way it used to be was the class of 25 and the class of 50 would always elect one person to speak on their behalf. And it became real clear that those individuals weren't always speaking on behalf of the class. So we kind of moved away from that. And what they do now is they videotape the class of 25 and the class of 50 having a conversation about their ministries. Then they edit it and they show it to everybody else, including you, if you want to see it. Each group, especially 50-year ministers, I think, come up and they use the lens of pentimento. Pentimento is a word that I first came across in a book by Lillian Hellman called Pentimento, where she looks at some of the relationships, the people that she's known in her life, and she uses the lens of pentimento. And here's what she says. Old paint on canvas, as it ages, sometimes becomes transparent. When that happens, it is possible in some pictures to see the original lines. You know, they always say that a lot of, especially in the older days, a lot of painters, because canvases cost so much, they would use old canvases, and oftentimes you would experience pentimento because you could see what was on the old canvas. I think that is so cool. Anyway, she goes to see, in some pictures, you could see the original lines. A tree will show through a woman's dress. A child makes way for a dog. A large boat is no longer on an open sea, and that is called pentimento, because the painter repented, changed his mind. Perhaps it would be as well to say that the old conception, replaced by a later choice, is a way of seeing, and then seeing again. It's a beautiful metaphor for anybody, not just painters, but for anybody. How often have we all used the lens of pentimento, a chance to repent, to see, and then to see again. So at the 25 and 50-year celebration, each minister has an opportunity for pentimento, of seeing and then seeing again and sharing with their colleagues. This year, it's my turn. I was ordained in May of 1975, so it's been 50 years. So I'm going to share my journey with you as I have begun to prepare to say to my colleagues. And colleagues can be pretty critical. So I've tried to be kind of selective. And this morning, after the first service, there was some criticism of what I had to say. So I will try to atone and repent and see again in my remarks to you, and then you can go back and see what changed between. No, that's asking too much. But this is the self-serving part, is that while I've written this for you, it's also been written for a second audience. In a week, I have to prepare it and give it on Zoom. As I said in my description of this sermon that went out as part of the weekly newsletter, I kind of look at my 50 years as a journey with roundabouts, those traffic circles. And you never run into those traffic circles when you're on the expressway, but it's just kind of amazing. And I was sharing this with somebody after the first service. I'll be out, in rural Maryland, and I'm tooling along at probably over the speed limit, and all of a sudden here's a traffic circle. It's just like I'm out in the middle of nowhere, and all of the different exits from the traffic circle appear to go nowhere. And it's just like, why? Why is this traffic circle out here? And there's a few traffic circles in DC that I purposely avoid because it's got stoplights and there's 3 or 4 exits, and it's just like you have to go around 2 or 3 times before you decide which exit you're going to get off on. And then people start honking at you, and they see you're from Maryland, and So my first big roundabout, my big first traffic circle came right after college. And that was when I knew I wanted to go to seminary. I knew I wanted to become a minister. So I applied to 3 different seminaries and got into all 3. And one of them was in Indianapolis, Indiana. In fact, it was just off campus from where I graduated, Butler University. And it was Christian Theological Seminary, which is a Disciples of Christ, which is the church I grew up in, a disciples seminary. And I was all ready to go there. And then a colleague of mine, my mentor, called and said, "So where are you going to go to seminary?" And I said, "Well, I got into Yale, I got into Union, but I'm going to stay here in Indianapolis and go to CTS." And there was silence. And he said, "Are you crazy? You could go to Union, you could go and live in New York City, and you're going to stay in Indianapolis?" And I hung up on him. I was so angry that he was trying to tell me where I was supposed to go. So a month later, we went to Union. We moved to New York City. And on their website today, this is what it says: that the school was founded in 1836 in New York City, and it has a globally recognized approach to graduate school theology, where faith, spirituality, and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of justice. Doesn't that sound great? That's not what they told me. A globally recognized liberal seminary and graduate school of theology, where faith, spirituality, and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of justice. I felt like if I could only partially live up to that description, I would have made it. So when I entered Union, it was with the intention of becoming a chaplain, what we now refer to as community ministry. I wanted to be a chaplain. And they offered a major, an area of concentration at Union that was in-depth psychology and theology. So I read a lot of Jung, a lot of Freud, Harry Stack Sullivan, Rollo May, all these great psychologists, and their relationship to theology. The advisor I was assigned was one of the greats, one of the big names, Daniel Day Williams. I know all of you are familiar with the work of Daniel Day Williams. He was a big name, and it's the kind of person, why you went to Union, Tillich taught there, Bonhoeffer taught there, Rollo May received his PhD at Union. I mean, that's why you went there. So I remember my first visit, my consultation with Daniel Day Williams, and I was just really excited. And he helped me plan out my next 3 semesters of courses. And by the end of the year, he died. And I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. It wasn't my decision. They assigned somebody else who wasn't nearly as good, as big a name as Williams. In fact, if I remember right, it was a PhD student. It wasn't quite the same. And then I started doing my fieldwork assignments, which were so Union. I mean, it was this blend of faith and justice, every one of them. One year I created and ran an after-school street ministry in the Bronx. I was part of an addiction recovery team in the East Village. I worked on a cell block at the Manhattan House of Detention for Men, which was known as the Tombs. And for 8 hours a week, I worked at 2 different hospitals. And then after graduation, and then ordination at Community Church in New York City, which was a horrible ordination. I mean, it wasn't very good. The music was bad. The minute my intern supervisor, who gave the charge to the minister, kept mispronouncing my name, and my parents were aghast. It's just like, do you even know this man? Anyway, he wrote me one letter. He dropped into his time when I was preaching, and I was a poor student, so I wore a suit and this gray sweater vest, and he latched on to the fact that I was wearing a gray sweater vest, and it wasn't very ministerial. And so I've saved that letter so I can show colleagues how unappreciative I was of this person who has long been gone. So after graduation and ordination, I began a 1-year hospital residency program in Brooklyn at a small hospital, because that's what chaplains did, right? And it was about 3 months into that chaplaincy that I realized, nope, this is not what I want to do. And the biggest issue for me was the length of a relationship that I had in the hospital was usually about 48 hours, and then people either were discharged or they died. And I wanted to create more long-lasting relationships. I wanted to give sermons. I wanted to go to committee meetings. I like committee meetings because that's where the work gets done. That's how you shape congregations and other people's lives. That's how you get to know people. None of that was really available to me in hospital chaplaincy. So after I completed my time there in August of 1976, I entered the roundabout of looking for a church. Now, for those of you who know the way the UUs do this, it's kind of a strange process. Well, the process I followed was really strange because there were a group of 3 ministers who were all looking at the same 3 churches in the state of Maine. And we all knew each other, and we all knew we were all looking at the same churches. And so those 3 church search committees all got together and invited us up for the same weekend. I mean, it's just like, what were they thinking? But they didn't have a lot of money, so we all went up there, and it all worked out. That was in the summer of 1976. Now, every time I mention to folks who don't know I've been to Maine, that's where I was, I get this starstruck twinkle in people's eyes, and then they say, oh, we love Maine. And when they say that, I have an idea I know where they've been, because Maine, for me, was divided into 3 sections. There is the far north, which is owned by the tree companies, and it's mostly woods. And then there's everything east of 95, which is where most people go, right? They go along the Gold Coast, east of 95. And then there's west of 95, which is the poor section of Maine. It's where all the mill towns were, and that's where I settled in ministry, was in a mill town. The mills had closed in 1950. The population more than halved after the mills shut down, and the mill executives who had started the church all left. All they left behind was a multi-million-dollar endowment that the church spent down. We lived in a parsonage that the wives of the mill owners had built. I joke that it was 100 steps from my bed to the pulpit. That's how close I was to the church. So it was a very unique and yet very New Englandish type of experience. We were there 7 years. And I joked this morning, and somebody took it all wrong. I joked saying we were there 5 years too long, because I never really had a good internship, not like the internship this church offered. And so being there 5 years, 7 years, was like having a 7-year internship. It's where I learned to preach. It's where I did memorial services. It's where I did christening services. It's where I did memorial services. It's where I had a lot of very, very intense counseling. It's all those things that maybe I should have learned or experienced during my internship, but it all happened there. And 7 years was too long. 2 years would have been good. So then I entered this process again, and here's the process of looking for another church. And here's the amazing thing about it was I was so estranged, really, from how looking for a church was supposed to work, that when I put my name in, I said there was only one church I wanted to go to, and that was Annapolis. As I understood it, there were 15 ministers who were looking at Annapolis, and they narrowed it down to 3 ministers, and eventually chose me. And a couple of funny stories about it was when I first came down here to interview, it was in June of 1983, the year which was the last time the Orioles won the World Series. So I came in June of '83, and I got off the plane, and it was like 95 degrees, and it was really hot and humid. And the people who met me said, "Don't worry, it's never like this." Because I was coming from Maine. They said, "Oh, don't worry about it." So, we had a good 3 or 4 days together. I preached in Rockville, and, then they sent me home. And then I was asked to be the candidate. And so I brought the whole family down in August of that year. And when we got off the plane, it was 105. And again, they said, "It's never like this. It's never that hot." And it turned out it's always that hot. It's always quite warm here. And you just kind of get used to it. So the vote was in August of 1983 to call me to the minister. This room looked basically the same, except there was no carpeting, the chairs were orange, everything was orange. And there was no air conditioning. It was a really, really hot August day. And they voted on me. They sent me out of the room, and then they called and told me the vote was 126-1 to call me. And I've never known who that one is. There's a couple people here who were part of that vote. I always had a suspicion, and I confronted the man, and he said it wasn't him. And I was told that it was just somebody who didn't believe in having unanimous votes. So he knew he needed a vote against me. So after about 2 years of being here, we began to wonder if we had made a mistake, that coming here was a mistake. And some of the reasons why was because we didn't like our house to begin with, and we kept looking for a new house. And anybody who looks for a house, it was expensive then, and as it is today, and we just couldn't find anywhere that we wouldn't have to do a total remodeling job on, and that we didn't want to do that. I'd never lived this close to the military before, and it was just like everywhere I went, the 25, 50 midshipmen would run by my house every day, and it's just like, who are these people? I'd never experienced anything like that before, and it was uncomfortable. I wasn't sure if I liked the kids that my kids were associating with. I knew nothing about boats. In fact, I have colleagues still who believe it's not fair that I live in Annapolis and I don't own a boat. And actually, 3 people have given me boats, and I've given them all away. I just don't do boats. I can't keep my house and car up. I couldn't keep a boat up either. So we entered that traffic circle of starting to look again, and got off at one exit that seemed to go nowhere, and we never made a U-turn. And now it's been 42 years, and I'm your minister emeritus. My wife passed away. My kids call this home, and I'm in the same house. So go figure. Let me just mention a couple really big areas of ministry that I was part of, but really you own these as much as I own these. And what I mean by that is that we are known in the UUA for these ministries. And the one that leaps to my mind right away is we became a teaching congregation. We had 21 interns. I supervised 19 of them. 2 of them were off-site, all the others were here. And the impact that we have had on the ministry is incredible, because all but 2 of those former interns, famesters, former Annapolis intern minister, all of those famesters are still practicing ministry. They're still in congregations. In fact, just yesterday, Christina Leon Tracy and Hannah Roberts Villeneuve were installed as co-ministers at the Appleton Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Appleton, Wisconsin. So that's a first, And for those of you who were here at the time, they actually worked together. Christina was the Minister of Religious Education, and she was incredible. And Hannah was the intern, and now they're doing ministry together. We loved our interns, and after virtually every one of them, people would say, "Do they have to go? Do they have to go?" And I'd say, "No, they have to go. They can't come back." And of course, 2 came back and served in congregation, Christina and Reverend Anastasia. But we really love our interns, and I have the sense that we feel that way about our current intern. We would love to keep him, and it ain't going to happen. He's going to go just like all the others had to go too. How many of you say, "Oh, to your children, please don't go. You can live in the basement." It just doesn't happen. They have to go, and they have to do their ministry. It was around 1991 when, following the completion of my doctoral dissertation, which this congregation was very gracious and gave me time to do that, I did my work in liberation theology. And when I completed my dissertation, my 2 dissertation professors said, "Okay, now you've got to go somewhere where they practice Unitarian Universalist liberation theology." And at the time, there was somebody in the congregation who owned a home in Guatemala, and she had lined up for me to go to Guatemala and live with some Catholic priests, and also as an association with some Catholic priests who were doing liberation theology in Nicaragua. And when I told my professors this, they said, "Those are Catholics. You want to go to where they practice UU liberation theology?" And of course, I didn't say anything at the time, but it was just like, where is that? So I started thinking about it, and in the back of my mind, I remember somebody saying that we had congregations in the Philippines. And like President McKinley, I had to go back to my map room and look to see where the Philippines was, because I wasn't sure where I was going to go. And within 6 weeks, I was in the Philippines. And looking at a group who practiced my version of Unitarian Universalist liberation theology. For those of you who don't know, about 400 miles south of Manila, there's an island named Negros. And on Negros, we have 28 Unitarian Universalist congregations. You have to read my book. There's a whole story behind how all that happened. When I came back, I was asked by the UUA if I was interested in being the UUA ambassador to the UU congregations of the Philippines. And immediately my kids envisioned my flying by private jet into Manila, being met on the tarmac by a black Suburban and being whisked off to wherever it was I was going to go. And nothing could have been further from the truth. That experience has led to quite a bit of more research. In fact, I signed with a publisher in December for a new book on neocolonialism and Unitarian Universalism, a book I'm sure you're all going to want to read, but more about that later. And then finally, around 1995, a shadow side of Unitarian Universalist ministry began to emerge, something that was already emerging throughout the entire nation, if not the entire world, and that was Unitarian Universalist clergy misconduct, specifically sexual misconduct. And it makes sense to a degree in this way, that it was emerging at this point. That's what makes sense. When I entered the ministry, I could count on one hand the number of women UU ministers that I knew of, and I knew only one, and I served with her in Maine. And all the men couldn't stand her. She was great, she was great, but the level of misogyny within Unitarian Universalism was pretty strong. Over the years, more and more women have become ministers, and now I read it's about 60% of UU ministers are women. And there was a concern expressed by men at the time that this was leading to the feminization of the UU ministry. I had never heard of anybody concerned about the masculinization, or whatever the word is, of UU ministry, which is the way it had been, for 200 years. But this feminization of ministry, part of what that included, and I feel like I need to wash my mouth even just saying it, but, with becoming more and more inclusive, brought all the skeletons and ghosts out of the closet. And I'll never forget being at a ministers' meeting over in Bethesda, and near the end of the meeting, the president of our clergy group tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Could I talk to you after the service?" And he said, "We really want to send you to a workshop to train you how to talk to our colleagues about clergy sexual misconduct." And I don't know what I was thinking, but I said, "Oh yeah, sure, I can do that." And it turned out to be probably the hardest ministry I have ever had to do. Needless to say, I was not well received among clergy, my friends, my colleagues. I used to get threatening phone calls at home, possible lawsuits against me and to the association. This led to a lot of not only workshops, but being flown around the country, talking to ministers and talking to the survivor victims of clergy misconduct and their families, many of whom have never to this day spoken out or spoken up. Even to the point where I was shocked in hearing a lecture some time ago of where the person giving the talk, a close colleague, a woman, referred to the Muir Commission. And it was just like, what was the Muir Commission? So I was taken back. It was a group that I was involved with where we had delivered a report, and I'd never heard it called the Muir Commission. So just a kind of a short, funny story about all of that, and the way that I brought this work into the congregation is that it was around the time, this makes me feel so old, it was around the time that President Clinton was being impeached, and I gave a sermon about why I thought he needed to step down, because he had used power over Ms. Lewinsky. And most of the congregation totally disagreed with me. I still think it's what he should have done. Al Gore would have probably been elected president had he been able to do that, my opinion. But interesting is that, I don't know how this happened, somewhere in the area was a film crew from Danish public TV. And they got word that I was giving this sermon, so they showed up and wanted to know if it was okay if they filmed the sermon and then talked to people in the congregation about their response to this sermon. And so by the next morning, Copenhagen TV was showing this documentary, and it just so happens that a member of the church who was Danish had family members who lived in Copenhagen, and they all called him and said, "Uncle Torben, you're on TV." And, and it's fun to watch that tape because all the narration, of course, is in Danish, but then all of you speaking is in English. So it feels trite saying it, but I must. I can't believe it's been 50 years. And ironically, that's why I felt some identification with Billy Collins's poem, where the 10-year-old is looking back on their life. And he ends the poem saying, "It seems only yesterday I used to believe there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I could shine. But now when I fall upon the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees, I bleed. I have fallen a lot, and I've given up a lot of blood. In fact, my hands and knees are pretty skinned up, and it's all been worth it. There are even times when I think I can still see the light under my skin. I occasionally still shine, and that feels really good." Thank you.